Today we will talk about arms race and disarmament in international relations. This is a very important component in the study of international relations because peace, war, conflict in international relations depend on the issue of arms race and disarmament. But the term is often confusing because arms race and disarmament, they overlap many times in the study of international relations. So first we need to know the actual meaning of the term arms race and disarmament. Now, disarmament this term became fashionable after the Hague Conference of 1899. Just on the eve of the 20th century, this conference actually, it was a conference to establish peace. It established the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which actually paved way for the later World Court of Justice, which is now functioning under the UN system. So this term disarmament, it first came into use during the Hague Conference of 1899, which, as I said, was a conference to establish peace. Because, as I also said, that it established the Permanent Court of Arbitration, firstly. It also created laws and customs on war and land. That is, it created laws on war prisoners, how the war prisoners would be handled, the land that is grabbed during the war or that is lost during the war, how the land would be repatriated or compensated. And moreover, the Hague Conference also created principles of maritime warfare. So, first attempt in modern times for disarmament arose, or it was created during the Hague Conference of 1899. Now I would try to give a specific definition of arms race and disarmament because these two are related somehow in the study of international relations. Now, arms race, to define it in a very cohesive manner, arms race is a tendency of states to have military superiority over others by acquiring arms. This creates an urge among rivals to procure more arms. This in turn leads to a security dilemma in international politics. And creates an arms race. Let us put it in more simple ways. In international politics, every state wants to pursue power. Now, in its pursuance of power, a state would like to have military superiority over others. And to get this military superiority, the state would want to procure more arms. This would lead to a security fear among its rivals, or sometimes the rivals and neighbors, because if country A becomes more efficient in arms, country B would also want to match country A in arms. So this creates an arms race. And the arms race is actually very dangerous for international peace. Arms race finally leads to war, as we have seen in history. So arms race is dangerous for world peace, and that is why the quest for disarmament also starts with arms race. Disarmament as a concept is actually it means no arms. That is, this wishes to demilitarize the states and help the states or to force the states not to acquire arms. But in international politics, it is very difficult. It is better said than done. That is, the urge to procure arms is there, it has been there, it will be there. That means when a state is pursuing power, when it is trying to grab more and more power, it would militarize itself. It would try to procure arms. So disarmament is very difficult to achieve and establish for a long period. That is, devoiding the states of arms is not an easy process. It is a very difficult process, but at the same time, this process must continue. That is, disarmament, the process of disarmament must continue, because more and more arms race would lead to conflict, would lead to war, and it would be dangerous for humanity. Therefore, the concept of disarmament is very, very important in international politics. Now, as I said, the quest for disarmament started in modern times with the Hague Conference in 1899. And it also continued thereafter. The Treaty of Versailles, concluded in the year 1919, limited the number of German troops, demilitarized specific zones, and outlawed German manufacture of aircraft, submarines, and tanker. So the Treaty of Versailles, it had specific provisions for disarmament in order to establish peace after the First World War. Now, if we continue to locate the efforts for disarmament, we will find that the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, it had also specific provisions on disarmament. It prepared an independent preparatory commission. The League of Nations had independent preparatory commission established in 1926 to prepare a draft treaty on disarmament and peace. And thereafter, after the League of Nations, the United Nations Organization, the UNO, it also has specific provisions on disarmament and peace. If we look at Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, we will find definite provisions on disarmament and on establishing peace. So the quest for disarmament continued along with the quest for arms race. That is why in the study of international relations, we try to study the two together, arms race and disarmament, because arms race leads to conflict, war, and that is why disarmament is necessary. In modern times, after the Second World War, we know that the Cold War started. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, it started after the Second World War. And the arms race reached its peak during the Cold War. The two superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union at that time, they always competed each other for the superiority of arms. And whenever one country procured modern arms, the other country wanted to match in terms of arms procurement. So during the Cold War, in recent times, the arms race reached its peak. Now, that is why throughout the Cold War period, disarmament efforts also continued. And the two superpowers, they realized that their arms race, their rivalry may lead to a dangerous situation in the world, and that is why they also pursued the process of arms disarmament, SALT I or SALT II. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. SALT-1, SALT-2, these also happened between the two superpowers during the Cold War period. I'll come to SALT more in a few minutes. But before that, we must know the techniques of disarmament, how disarmament, the efforts for disarmament works actually. There are 6 techniques for disarmament, for achieving disarmament. I repeat, 6 techniques for achieving disarmament. The first is limitation and reduction of arms. It means, as the term suggests, as the proposition suggests, that it aims to limit arms, it aims to reduce arms. Now, how that is possible, how that can be achieved? That leads us to the second technique, that is through demilitarization, denuclearization, and neutralization. I repeat, the second technique is demilitarization, denuclearization, and neutralization. Now, demilitarization is, of course, preventing or disallowing the build-up of military. We know that after the Second World War, Japan was prevented to build military. The constitutional provisions of Japan, it also, the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, it vowed not to establish a big military. Now, denuclearization process continued throughout the Cold War period, and several important treaties were signed to denuclearize the states, that is, from achieving nuclear weapons for the purpose of war. So, we can talk about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which actually wanted denuclearization of the world. And sometimes neutralization means that neutralizing the effects of arms, neutralizing the rivalry of two nations, although it is very difficult to achieve, but the efforts always continued. Even we have seen this effort during the height of the Cold War between the two superpowers. The third technique of disarmament is regulating or outlawing specific weapons. This is very important. Regulating or outlawing specific weapons. Now, we live in a time when the WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, they are posing a huge danger for the survival of humanity, for the survival of the world. Now, therefore, regulating nuclear weapons, and not only nuclear weapons, other WMDs like chemical or biological weapons, regulating these weapons or outlawing specific weapons, this is a part of the disarmament process. We have seen that in recent times in Iraq, chemical weapons, the world community sought to outlaw Iraq for allegedly stockpiling chemical weapons. So these efforts are, we may say, part of disarmament. Now, the fourth technique is controlling arms manufacture and traffic. This is again a very important area, controlling arms manufacture and arms traffic, although it is again better said than done, because arms business, arms market, arms business and finding arms market globally is a very, very lucrative business for even the states. it is a very profitable business, we may say, arms business. So controlling arms manufacture, which is one technique of disarmament, is difficult, although this controlling arms manufacture is also vital. So this is another area where disarmament seeks to go. I mean, controlling arms manufacture and arms traffic. That means controlling arms trade also. And the most important technique is the fifth technique, that is laws of war. We know in our times nothing can be enforced. We have to go by law, either nationally or internationally. We have to go by the provisions of law. So one important technique of disarmament is the establishing laws of war. It was first sought to be established during the Hague Conference. As I said, laws of war was established during the Hague Conference, and it has become one of the major techniques of disarmament. How war prisoners should be handled, how war refugees would be controlled, would be maintained, and how to eliminate war. What are war before and after, the consequences of war may also prove to be dangerous for the world. So there are war laws, as I said, the prisoners of war, the people who are displaced during the war, not only people, sometimes people are forced to leave a certain land and go to another land. So the land issue also becomes important. All these come under the laws of war. So this is one important technique. I placed it as a fifth technique of disarmament, that is laws of war. The sixth and final technique of disarmament is stabilizing the international environment. This is also very important in our times. That is, maintaining an international environment which would minimize the possibilities of war. And in several ways, this international environment may be created. First of all, through increasing cooperation among nation states. This increasing cooperation includes not only diplomatic or political cooperation. In our times, it includes economic cooperation. That is, economic diplomacy is the key word in our times. So when states are engaged more and more in economic cooperation, international environment becomes more stable and the dangers of war gets minimized. So therefore, stabilizing the international environment through increasing cooperation in all segments, science and technology, cultural, economic, political, in all security, in all segments, if the nations cooperate, if their interests come together, if they help each other, international environment may get stabilized. But again, this is not an easy task, because states only cooperate when their interests match, when their interests come closer. But in international politics, we have seen that there are diverse or sometimes opposing national interests. That leads to war. So one must work, the states must work towards getting closure, so that their interests come closer. Economic cooperation is one way of achieving this closer cooperation nowadays. And through economic cooperation, political rivalry can be minimized. In our times, there are several instances where through economic cooperation, political rivalry has been minimized. So, stabilizing the international environment through cooperation of states in all areas is the key word, is the key technique of disarmament in our times. Therefore, disarmament, it is not just a word in the dictionary, it is not just a word in international politics, international relations. It is a method which works through several techniques, and I outlined the main techniques, the 6 major techniques of disarmament. Now I would talk about some important disarmament efforts in recent times. I talked about SALT 1 and 2, SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which specifically started during the mid-1970s, 76 to be exact. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, when both the superpowers, USA and Soviet Union, they sat together to limit arms. As I said, limitation and reduction of arms is one of the important techniques of disarmament. So we have seen a practical demonstration of this technique with SALT 1, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1, between the 2 superpowers during the peak of the Cold War period in 1976. We have seen Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1, and later on during the mid-80s we have also seen Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, SALT 2, between the 2 superpowers. Both the superpowers sought to limit and reduce arms because they realized that it was not only pinching on their national budget, it was not only making inroads into their national budget, but it was also getting dangerous for world peace. Therefore, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks happened, among other efforts of disarmament. Later on, we have seen START 1 and 2. R here stands for reduction, that is Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, START 1 and START 2. Even that is continuing, because after the Cold War, Russia has retained the legacy of the former Soviet Union, and now Russia has retained almost 90 to 95% of the nuclear arsenals of former Soviet Union. So we cannot say that with the end of the Cold War the arms race has come to an end. There is a feeling, there is a tendency to believe that with the end of the Cold War, arms race has also come to an end. But we must remember that arms race has not stopped, and arms race is still continuing. As long as the tendency to achieve more and more superiority among the states survive, the tendency to procure arms would also survive. So therefore, START talks continued after the Cold War, that is during the post-Cold War period. The START talks also wanted to reduce arms. Therefore, during the Cold War, arms race continued throughout the Cold War period, and disarmament efforts also continued throughout the Cold War period. After the Cold War, during the post-Cold War period, disarmament efforts also continued. So we may conclude by saying that disarmament techniques, disarmament methods are always necessary. In recent times, we have seen several disarmament, efforts at achieving disarmament, like the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CWC, Chemical Weapons Convention, the BWC, Biological Weapons Convention, the FMCT, Fissile Material Control Treaty, the MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime. These are all parts of disarmament. So disarmament efforts are continuing for achieving world peace, for stabilizing global peace, for stabilizing international peace among nations.